on the tracks of New Zealand and then reborn on the roads of Britain. This supercar-making racing team is one of the benchmarks for modern supercars. McLaren. Let's get one thing straight right out of the gate. McLaren was never a road car company. They were founded for racing by a racing driver. That racing driver being Bruce McLaren, the young New Zealander who started racing in the Tasman series, won that, moved up to Formula 2 with Cooper Climax, won successes there, including a 5th place finish at the Nürburgring against a field of world-class Formula 1 drivers. That, in turn, gave him a seat in Cooper's Formula 1 team. He managed to become the youngest F1 Grand Prix winner ever, until Max Verstappen, at the 1959 US Grand Prix at just 22 years and 104 days old. That's quite impressive. And he won another 3 races in the next 6 years. Again, with a very uncompetitive car. This guy was pretty darn good. I mean, he even, air quotes, won the 24 Hours of Le Mans with Ford in the GT40. Why air quotes? That's a very long story, but if you've seen Ford v Ferrari, you know why. But that's not the point. The point is, he was so good at motor racing, he followed his fellow countryman's footsteps, aka Jack Brabham, and founded his own racing team in 1966. And I'll be honest, it didn't start out very well. Between 1966 and 1967, they only finished in the points 4 times. But by 1968, things were starting to change. They had Ford's DFV Cosworth V8, and they started winning races. And Bruce himself became one of the only drivers ever to win a Grand Prix with his own car, when he won the 1968 Belgian Grand Prix. His team that year finished 2nd overall in the championship, and his exposure led him to open up more opportunities. And by more opportunities, I mean to dominate Can-Am racing here in the States. The M8D he was developing weighed less than 2,000 pounds and made 670 horsepower from a naturally aspirated 7.6 liter naturally aspirated V8. The Can-Am cars were arguably faster than Formula 1 cars of the era, with their revolutionary active aerodynamics, suction power, and, ridiculous power to weight ratios. They were insane monsters that racing has never seen before or since. That's why I did a whole video on them. But that also led to their undoing, and Bruce McLaren sadly found that out the hard way. In 1970, he was testing the M8D at the Goodwood circuit in England when the rear bodywork flew off, spearing him into a marshal's post, killing him instantly. But his team would carry on his legacy and would go on to win 20 Formula 1 World Championships with the likes of Ayrton Senna, Niki Lauda, James Hunt, with most of it under the management of Ron Dennis, who also helped start their other side project. You see, while waiting for a delayed flight in the 1980s, Ron was talking with his Formula 1 car designer, Gordon Murray, about finally building this road car. You see, back in the 1960s, Bruce had wanted to build a road car called the M6 GT. A prototype was made with 370 horsepower, and it was very, very good, but it died with him, unfortunately, and the project never went forward after his death. So the two of them agreed, if they were going to build a road car, they would do it right, do it proper. No expenses would be spared, no material would be wasted, it would be the ultimate road car. And the result of this no-holds-barred process was the legendary F1. We did a whole video on this. because it's a carbon fiber, gold-plated, 3-seater road car making 627 horsepower from a BMW-sourced 6.1-liter V12. And thanks to the incredibly low drag coefficient from the streamlined bodywork, it could hit 240.1 miles an hour. Not only was it the fastest production car in the world at the time, it is still, to this day, the fastest naturally aspirated road car of all time. And it did all of that while being pretty practical for a road car, to be honest. It actually had storage compartments in the side for your luggage, where the side pods would normally be for an intake. And it had no flywheel, and it was easy to drive. It was very strange. While at the same time, it could rip your face off on a track. It was so good, it was famously called the car they detuned to win Le Mans, because they took some of the power out to 601 horsepower, added a rear wing, stripped out the interior and put some race tires on it, called it a day, and it won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright in 1995, which, fun fact, gave McLaren the honor of being the only team to ever win the Indy 500, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the Monaco Grand Prix. Fun fact. But it didn't really work as planned. McLaren cars only made 106 of them. There was even less of that in the world after Elon Musk crashed his, and Mr. Bean crashed his, and the Sultan of Brunei lost his, and El Chapo lost his. So there's probably less than 100 in the world now. It didn't matter because they only made 106 of them. And McLaren cars just sort of sat there twiddling their thumbs after that. They had a little side project with Mercedes in 2005 called the SLR, but that was really just them helping Mercedes. And apart from some Formula 1 racing, they didn't do anything at all. Until 2011, when McLaren got back in the road car saddle with the, MP4-12C. Yes, it was the stupidest name since the 812 Superfast, but the car was very clever. The chassis was completely made of carbon fiber composite. The rear brakes could be applied by the computer to reduce understeer during a corner. And the suspension was completely fly-by-wire to not only improve handling when you needed it, but to also make your ride more comfortable on a bumpy road. It was a brilliant car. And then there was the in-house designed M838 Turbo V8 engine. This twin-turbocharged 3.8-liter V8 made 600 horsepower, while generating just 279 grams per kilometer of CO2. I know that number means literally nothing to 99.9% of the world, but apparently, according to McLaren, it is the best horsepower to CO2 ratio of any car ever made. So there you go. It can be environmentally friendly while also capable of doing 215 miles an hour and lapping the top of your test track just a second slower than a V8 powered aerial atom. You can't do them at the same time, obviously, but you could do either or. You could destroy the top of your lap time charts, or you could be environmentally friendly. Pick or choose. But critically, unlike the F1, this was an actual success. The F1 is one of the greatest cars ever made, no doubt. But nothing came of it apart from a legendary car. And while that's enough for a lot of people, for McLaren cars, they just sort of sat there, minding their own business after that. They never did anything again. But the 12C successfully launched McLaren as a road car company, unlike what the F1 did. And that meant that they made the 540C, the 570C, the 625C, the 650S, the 600LT, and the brutal 675 Longtail. But if you want the creme de la crop of that sort of supercar class, you gotta get the 720S. Because this thing is a 710 horsepower, mid-engined V8 monster. It still uses a similar engine as the 12C, because that engine is, McLaren's, one-stop shop, pretty much. But now it makes 700 horsepower, plus. It's even more efficient. It's lighter. And the car is even cleverer. The fly-by-wire systems have been improved. The weight has been cut down. The entire body is now carbon fiber, not just up to the doors. That lowers the center of gravity. Then, there's all the electronic fiddly bits that are even more complicated than the previous McLarens. There's even a variable drift control. If you don't know how to drift, it can basically drift for you. Which I guess is fun if you're showing off to your friends. I don't know. But that is available if you want it. Oh, and even the dashboard, which is by far the coolest thing, can flip down so you're not seeing the screen. You're just seeing a little bar that tells you when to shift with the little lights. It's awesome. It's like a Formula 1 car. I love it. It's my favorite part of the car. But more importantly to McLaren, it looks a lot better. McLaren's have always been function over form. They were designed on a computer software by computer nerds. And deep down you knew that the Ferrari looked better and was almost as fast, so why not just buy a Ferrari? But the 720S, instead of having these stupid vents on the side to funnel air into the engine bay, it has little slats running along, not the roof line, but like the sides of the cabin, and that funnels air into the engine, not the sides. The sides are nice and clean, which not only reduces drag, but it looks a lot nicer. This is a damn good looking car. By far the best McLaren since the F1 in terms of looks. It's a great looking car. But saying all of that, I would still take the P1. The P1 was McLaren's answer to the Holy Trinity. The Porsche 918 and the Ferrari. When it was unveiled in 2013 at Geneva, it had, again, the 838T engine, but now it had an electric motor going with it to make a ridiculous 903 horsepower in a rear-wheel drive hypercar. It was brutal. Not only was it brutal to drive, it was brutally fast. It could do 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds, the quarter mile in 9.8 seconds. And in order to control all of that fury, it was incredibly high-tech. It had active aerodynamics with DRS, an actual Formula 1 curve system to recover energy during braking, specifically developed Pirelli tires and new carbon ceramic brakes. Then, in order to cut the weight down to offset the electric hybrid system, the paint had no lacquer to save a few grams. The body is made of 5 carbon fiber panels, which meant there were less bolts and less glue needed to keep it together. It was the greatest McLaren since the F1, and McLaren wanted more, if you would believe it. It was called the GTR, and it was a road illegal version of the P1. Which meant it was faster, lighter, more powerful, and even massiver aerodynamics. So they made a road legal version of the road illegal version of the road version. I think they made one. It's a Nürburgring lap record, but it couldn't be officially counted because they made one. Then they made the 720S that I already mentioned earlier, which is basically a non-hybrid version with a new body of the P1. Then their next hybrid successor was the Speedtail, which is both the successor to the hybrid P1 and the 3-seater F1. This thing is a 1,000 horsepower V8 hypercar. There's no other way of putting it. It's the fastest McLaren ever made. Top speed excess of 240 miles an hour. I don't like the look of it because it's way too streamlined. It's got the weird wheel covers, it's got no mirrors, it's smoother than glass. But if it takes your fancy, then I'll go for it. Spend a few $1,000,000 on that incredibly fast car. Personally, I would rather have the Senna, which is weird because a lot of people prefer the Speedtail to the Senna, but I prefer the Senna. because of what it represents. Naming a car the Senna, after McLaren's racing driver from the 1980s, aka three-time world champion, aka Brazilian legend, aka one of the greatest racing drivers of all time, you need to have some backup to that name. And the Senna delivers it. It is the ultimate road legal car, which is exactly what you want when you're naming your car the Senna. It has to be great on the track first and foremost. It started out as a 720S chassis and engine, but the engine was tuned up to 800 horsepower, and the chassis weight was dropped to 3,000 pounds. All in all, it pulls 1.8 Gs to 0 to 60 in under 2.9 seconds, and destroyed current drivers' lightning lap time around Virginia International Raceway by 2.9 seconds. But how? Aerodynamics. You may have noticed it, but this thing is very function over form, like the McLarens of old, but I think this one works, because again, it's supposed to be a track car in the spirit of how Senna would want a car to handle. And that means turning like the wind. Whether it be the massive front splitter, the active flaps that can cool the brakes or reduce drag depending on position where the fog lights should be, or the somehow road legal active aerodynamics that actually hang from the pillars instead of being placed on top of them, just to generate that little bit more downforce, or the F1 double diffuser. All in all, it generates half its weight in downforce, combining all of them together. That is incredible. And if you go for the track-only GTR version, you get even more weight in downforce, with even more aerodynamics, with even more power. It may look divisive, but this is the ultimate track day car, and I think it's one of the most radical McLarens ever made. But if it doesn't tickle your fancy, but you still want to go fast and spend $1 million while doing it, you could get the $1.7 million, 800 horsepower, roofless Elva Speedster. Yeah. It's a damn good looking car. It's very fast. Uses some very clever windshield, not a windshield technology. It's like a little flap at the front that diverts air, just like a windshield, so you don't get wind blasted at 204. But either way, you could go for the opposite of the Elva, with the much more relaxed, much calmer GT car. Yeah, McLaren's first ever Grand Touring car is very practical. You can fit like a set of skis probably, and maybe a bag or two. It's comfortable. It's designed to be cruising through the Alps, not cruising down the Nürburgring. And it's very much comfort over speed. Of course, it still does 208 miles an hour, but that's just McLaren for you. So what does the future bring? Well, that very much depends on what you're talking about. Their road versions are thriving as ever. They're incredibly popular. They're very successful despite not making any SUVs. As for their Formula One program, they're getting their best results ever in a decade, with a third place in the 2020 season, thank you Lando Norris. And if you're talking about Indy, well, we don't really like to talk about Indy at McLaren. I mean, they got shut out in 2019 by a nobody team with no sponsors from even competing, and they didn't compete at all in 2020 because they thought oval racing was easy, and then they got their asses handed to them, for the lack of a better term. And they're potentially joining Formula E, so their open-wheel future is very bright, and their sports car racing and their sports cars in general are doing very well. So McLaren, despite the changing political climate on the internal combustion engine, is doing pretty darn fine, I would say.